On a November afternoon in 1855, a young surgeon borrowed a watch to keep track of time during his house calls. He would never return it, because something was waiting for him on a lonely country lane that would turn his final moments into a nightmare of unimaginable brutality. The year was 1855, and the Industrial Revolution was transforming England's countryside at breakneck speed. But in the quiet villages of County Durham, time seemed to move at the pace it always had. Until one autumn day when violence shattered that illusion forever. Robert Sterling was everything you'd expect from a 26-year-old Scottish surgeon of his era. Ambitious, well-educated, and eager to make his mark in the world. He'd recently packed up his life in Scotland and made the journey south to the village of Burnopfield, where he'd secured a position working alongside the respected Dr. William Watson. Like many young professionals of his time, Sterling was still finding his footing in this new chapter of his life. His belongings were still making their way down from Scotland in horse-drawn wagons, including his personal timepiece. So when duty called on November 1st, he did what any resourceful young man would do. He borrowed a silver pocket watch from one of Dr. Watson's assistants. That borrowed watch would become the centerpiece of one of Victorian England's most brutal and perplexing murder cases. The morning of November 1st started like any other for Sterling. He had a full day of house calls ahead of him, first in Burnopfield, then a journey down to the neighboring village of Spen. This was the unglamorous side of 19th century medicine, trudging from cottage to cottage, treating everything from consumption to broken bones with the limited tools of the trade. But Sterling approached his work with the dedication you'd expect from someone who'd invested years in medical training. By early afternoon, he'd completed his rounds in Spen and was preparing for the walk back to Burnopfield. The route was simple enough: down Smiles Lane, a winding country road that cut through the Derwent Valley. Today, this area bustles with traffic and development, but in 1855, Smiles Lane was exactly what its bucolic name suggested. A quiet country path bordered by thick bushes and steep banks that dropped down toward the River Derwent below. What Sterling didn't know as he set off from Spen around 1 o'clock that afternoon was that he wasn't alone on that lonely stretch of road. Hiding in the undergrowth beside Smiles Lane were two figures, and they'd been waiting. Whether they were waiting specifically for Robert Sterling or simply for any well-dressed gentleman who might be carrying valuables, remains one of the many mysteries surrounding this case. A drover, a cattle herder, had crossed the Derwent Bridge just minutes before Sterling's arrival. As he approached the junction where Smiles Lane met the main road, something caught his attention. Two suspicious-looking men lurking in the bushes beside the lane. One appeared to be holding either a walking stick or something longer, something more sinister. The drover's instincts screamed danger. He was about to turn back when the two men noticed him watching. Not wanting to provoke whatever these characters were planning, he decided to continue on his way, hurrying past them as quickly as he could manage without breaking into a run. Minutes later, the drover encountered another traveler heading in the opposite direction. A well-dressed gentleman in a black suit, twirling a walking stick as he strolled down Smiles Lane. They exchanged pleasantries, and the drover couldn't help but notice the man's thick Scottish accent. That gentleman was Robert Sterling, walking directly into what would become his final moments on Earth. The drover continued up the road, but he hadn't gone far when he heard it. A sharp crack echoing across the valley. A gunshot, then shouting. This wasn't unusual in the English countryside where hunting was a common pastime. The drover assumed he was hearing the sounds of a fox hunt and went about his business. What he'd actually heard was the beginning of one of the most savage murders in Victorian crime history. The two men hiding in the bushes had emerged just as Sterling reached their position. Without warning, without demands for his money, they'd fired a rifle directly into his stomach. The young surgeon, mortally wounded but still alive, was dragged off the road and down into the thick undergrowth that lined the steep bank. But the gunshot was only the beginning of Sterling's ordeal. What happened next in those bushes beside Smiles Lane defies comprehension. The attackers weren't content with robbery. They seemed driven by a fury that went far beyond mere criminal intent. Using the butt of their rifle as a weapon, they systematically destroyed Sterling's face, caving in large sections of his skull with repeated blows. When the rifle butt wasn't enough, they pulled out a knife and began slashing at what remained of his face before drawing the blade across his throat. Through all of this brutality, Robert Sterling remained conscious. We know this because of what searchers found days later when his body was finally discovered. His hands were clasped together, and between his fingers was a clump of grass and earth that he'd torn from the ground in his final agony. But perhaps the most chilling detail of all comes from that farm laborer working across the river. After he heard the initial gunshot and Sterling's cry of "Oh dear," he reported hearing the sound of hands clapping and voices shouting, "Hoy! Hoy!" These weren't random sounds. Sterling's killers were deliberately mimicking the calls used during fox hunts, creating an audio camouflage for their victims' screams. They were ensuring that anyone who heard the commotion would dismiss it as nothing more than local hunters pursuing their quarry. When Sterling failed to return from his rounds that evening, his absence initially raised little alarm. Young men in his position sometimes abandoned their posts without notice, seeking better opportunities elsewhere. But as hours turned to days, concern began to mount. The person most concerned was Sterling's father back in Scotland. When news of his son's disappearance reached him, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Robert wasn't the type to abandon his responsibilities, especially not without sending word home. The elder Sterling traveled down from Scotland to organize a proper search of the area where his son had last been seen. Local volunteers combed the countryside around Smiles Lane, looking for any trace of the missing surgeon. It was a discarded hat that finally led them to the truth. Someone spotted what appeared to be a gentleman's hat lying beside Smiles Lane, partway down the steep bank that led to the river. Following this trail, the searchers made their way through the thick undergrowth until they found what remained of Robert Sterling. The condition of the body shocked even the hardened country folk who discovered it. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. It was a deliberate act of extreme violence that seemed to serve no rational purpose. The local police found themselves facing a puzzle. Sterling's valuables were missing, including that borrowed silver watch, but the level of violence suggested something more personal than a routine highway robbery. Someone had wanted Robert Sterling to suffer. With no forensic science to speak of and limited investigative techniques, the authorities did what they always did in such cases. They offered a reward. £300 was an enormous sum in 1855, equivalent to roughly £30,000 today. When that didn't immediately produce results, they raised it to £500. Money talks, and eventually information began to trickle in. Several witnesses came forward with reports of suspicious characters hanging around Smiles Lane on the day of the murder. Two names kept appearing in these accounts: John Kane, better known locally as Whiskey Jack, and Richard Rain, a blacksmith. Whiskey Jack had earned his nickname through his side business running an illegal whiskey still somewhere in the countryside around Burnup Field. This made him intimately familiar with the back roads and hidden paths of the area, knowledge that would be invaluable for someone planning an ambush. Richard Rain, meanwhile, was known as a man with a quick temper and questionable associates. Both men had been seen loitering near Smiles Lane on November 1st, and both had behaved strangely in the days following Sterling's disappearance. When police brought them in for questioning, the evidence began to mount. Whiskey Jack's clothing showed clear bloodstains, and he carried a knife that also bore traces of blood. His explanation, that he'd been skinning rabbits, might have been plausible if not for one crucial detail. His coat was missing a distinctive brass button, and searchers had found an identical button at the murder scene. Richard Rain, meanwhile, had attempted to sell a silver pocket watch to a pawnbroker in Durham shortly after the murder. The broker had refused the transaction, likely suspecting the watch was stolen and the timepiece had vanished without a trace. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A local woman named Elizabeth Wilson came forward with a story that painted a chilling picture of the hours immediately following Sterling's murder. She reported that both Whiskey Jack and Richard Rain had appeared at a nearby tavern on the evening of November 1st, asking her to wash their clothes. The garments she was handed were soaked with blood, not just spots or spatters, but completely saturated, as if the sleeves had been wrung out in it. When she asked about the blood, Whiskey Jack had laughed and said he'd been here, there, and everywhere skinning a hare. Both men had found her concerns amusing, joking about whether they'd both been killing a hare. They'd also requested materials to clean a gun. As the investigation progressed, an even more disturbing picture began to emerge. Evidence suggested that Robert Sterling might not have been the intended victim at all. A local farmer named Anderson was known to walk down Smiles Lane every November 1st, carrying his annual rent payment to his landlord. Anderson was acquainted with Whiskey Jack, who would have known about this routine and the fact that the farmer would be carrying a substantial sum of money. But here's where the case takes a turn into the genuinely inexplicable. On the night of October 31st, the evening before the murder, Anderson and several members of his household all experienced the same disturbing dream. In each vision, something terrible would befall Anderson if he took his usual route down Smiles Lane to pay his rent. The dreams were so vivid and so unanimous among the household that Anderson decided to break from his routine. Instead of taking Smiles Lane, he chose a different path to reach his landlord's property. By changing his route, Anderson had unknowingly avoided walking into an ambush meant for him. But the supernatural elements of this case don't end there. On the same night that Anderson's household was experiencing their prophetic dreams, something equally strange was happening miles away in Scotland. Mrs. Sterling, Robert's mother, was awakened by what she later described as a fearful dream. In her vision, she saw a dark-complexioned man in dark clothing approach her window. He raised a gun and fired it directly at her. The dream was so vivid and disturbing that it remained burned in her memory for days. It wasn't until nearly a week later that news of her son's murder reached Scotland. When Mrs. Sterling traveled to Durham for the trial of her son's suspected killers, she asked to see the accused men. At the prison, several men were exercising in the yard, including Kane, Rain, and various guards and prisoners. Without being told which men were the accused, Mrs. Sterling immediately pointed to Richard Rain and identified him as the man from her dream, the figure who had fired a gun at her through the window. She then burst into tears. Despite the seemingly overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the case against Whiskey Jack and Richard Rain began to fall apart in court. Victorian forensic science couldn't prove that the blood on their clothes belonged to Robert Sterling. The missing watch was never recovered. The brass button, while suspicious, wasn't conclusive proof. All the prosecution could definitively prove was that both men had been in the area at the time of the murder and had behaved suspiciously afterward. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty and both men walked free, but the story doesn't end there. In the years following the trial, another suspect emerged. Thomas Smith, known locally as Lanky Smith, had been working as a farm laborer in Burnup Field at the time of Sterling's murder. He was known to be a poacher, someone who would have been intimately familiar with the hidden paths and secluded spots around Smiles Lane. When Sterling's body was discovered, Lanky Smith had fled town immediately, not even staying to collect his final paycheck from his employer. Years later, he would be convicted and executed for murdering another man in a different county. Could Lanky Smith have been Sterling's real killer? The timing of his flight certainly seems suspicious, but like so many aspects of this case, we'll never know for certain. Today, nearly 170 years after Robert Sterling's brutal murder, the case remains officially unsolved. Smiles Lane has been renamed Sterling Lane in the victim's honor, and housing developments have transformed the once lonely countryside into a busy suburban area. But according to local legend, some echoes of that terrible November day remain. People walking down Sterling Lane late at night report hearing the sound of a man calling for help somewhere in the darkness. When they investigate, they claim to see a figure standing among the trees, a man with a caved-in face, his throat cut open, and a gaping wound in his belly. Other witnesses describe seeing two pairs of glowing eyes watching them from the bushes, just as the original attackers once watched for their victims. Are these genuine supernatural encounters, or simply the power of suggestion working on people who know the lane's dark history? That's for each person to decide for themselves. What we do know for certain is that on November 1st, 1855, a young man set out to serve his community as a healer and never returned home. His murder remains one of Victorian England's most brutal unsolved crimes, a reminder that some questions may never have answers, and some debts can never be repaid. Robert Sterling borrowed a watch to keep track of time, but time itself would stop for him on that lonely stretch of road that now bears his name. And somewhere out there, the truth about who killed him remains buried as deeply as his body once was in the undergrowth beside that dark country lane. The case of the Sterling Lane murder reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with clear motives or obvious suspects. Sometimes it lurks in the shadows beside quiet country roads, waiting for an innocent person to walk into its path. And sometimes that evil is never truly brought to justice.